On June 4th, 1989, a boater spots something floating in Tampa Bay. At first, he thinks it's debris, but as his boat gets closer, he realizes it's not. It's a body. And then another and another. 3 women bound, gagged, and weighed down. And just like that, Tampa Bay goes from a summer paradise to the center of one of Florida's most chilling murder investigations. We're talking about a mom and her 2 teenage daughters who were just on vacation. They had no idea that accepting help from a friendly stranger would seal their fate. Some of the details in this case will stay with you long after you hear them. So, let's get into it. June 4th, 1989 began like any other summer day in Florida, hot, still, and almost too beautiful for what was about to surface. The amber waves, a sailboat heading home to Tampa after a trip to Key West, had just passed beneath the Skyway Bridge when someone on board spotted something unusual in the water. At first, it was just a shape. Then, someone said it. "I think that's a body." She was floating face down, arms tied behind her back, ankles bound, a thin yellow rope still looped around her neck. She was naked from the waist down. There was no mistaking it. The Coast Guard got the call just after noon. A rescue boat was launched from Bayboro Harbor. The crew spotted her quickly, but pulling her from the water wasn't easy. The rope around her neck stretched down, deep into the bay, anchored to something heavy below. The crew made note of the location, then cut the line, placed her in a body bag, and started back to shore. They hadn't made it far when another call crackled through the radio. There was another one, a second female body, same haunting position, face down, bound, drifting to the north, just 2 miles off the St. Petersburg Pier. Again, the rope. Again, the water hiding whatever it was pulling them down. As they worked to recover the second woman, another sighting came in, a third body. 3 women, all within reach of each other, all in the same condition. The waters of Tampa Bay had become a graveyard. By the time the Coast Guard boat docked, police were already waiting. They took photos, examined the bodies. Time and the water had already begun to steal the details, but enough remained. What had started as a sunny Sunday sail had become the beginning of a mystery that would stretch far beyond the shoreline. Each of the 3 women had been bound with the same careful cruelty. Duct tape across their mouths, limbs tied, and ropes looped around their necks. 2 of those ropes were still attached to concrete blocks, and the third had been cut by the Coast Guard, but the weight had almost certainly been there. But one of them had resisted. Her left hand had broken free, as if in those final moments she refused to go quietly. On shore, the bodies were laid out on the dock, and detectives began their grim task. With all 3 women found partially unclothed, sexual assault seemed likely. Yet, there was no visual signs of trauma, no bruising, no stab wounds, no bullet holes. One haunting possibility rose to the top: that the women had been alive when they were thrown into the bay, bound, gagged, and left to sink. But certainty would have to wait. The autopsies had yet to begin. And before detectives could hunt for a killer, they first had to answer a simpler question. Who were these women? They had no IDs, no wallets, no purses, no names. No one had yet reported 3 women missing. All that investigators had were fragments of their identities: jewelry, clothing, hair. One woman, likely the oldest, had long brown hair and wore a black t-shirt. A gold wedding band rested on her ring finger. Another wore a peach-colored shirt. Her wrist held 3 handmade cloth bracelets, braided in pink, green, and white. And then there was the young woman who had fought to free her hand. Wavy brown hair, a black tank layered over a blue bikini top. 4 rings, 2 gold, 2 silver, one on each finger of her freed hand. 3 women, no names, no voices left to tell their stories. But someone, somewhere, was missing them. Have they called? Not yet. Jeff was getting impatient because Michelle was supposed to be back by now. He kept calling the farm, asking Hal if he had heard anything from them. Hal was trying to stay rational. He called Joe's friends, her boss, anyone who might have heard from them. He filed missing persons reports, checked with local law enforcement, retraced every detail he could think of. But every call ended the same way. No one had heard a thing. Then Jeff called again. This time, he had something. The postcard Michelle sent him had finally arrived. It wasn't much, but it was something. The only proof Hal had that they'd made it to Florida at all. And yet, it made everything worse. Because now he knew she'd been alive long enough to write it, and that something must have gone wrong after. He began pacing the house, smoking cigarette after cigarette. Images flooded his mind: a crash into a ditch, a robbery gone wrong, Joe and the girls injured and waiting, praying someone would find them. Hal couldn't take it anymore. He walked into the bank that Wednesday, June 6th, and withdrew a large sum of cash. If no one else could find them, then he would. He didn't care how far he had to go or what it would cost. He was going to hire a plane, get a pilot, and fly the path they'd taken, mile by mile, road by road, between Ohio and Florida. One way or another, Hal Rogers was going to find his girls. It was Thursday morning, June 8th, when the housekeeper finally said something about room 251. The room had been quiet for too long, a week at least. The suitcases were still sitting where they'd first been dropped, one by the door, one slumped near the bed. A purse sat untouched on the table. Clothes, toiletries, toothpaste with Sesame Street characters. But the beds were still made. The bathroom was pristine. No wet towels, no signs of showers or sleep. It looked like someone had checked in and then vanished. The maid paused in the doorway that morning and decided something wasn't right. She took her concern to the general manager, who called the Tampa police. A guest, maybe more than one, had gone missing, and everything they owned was still in that room. Across Tampa Bay, the news had already broken. 3 young women found floating in the water, bound, weighted down, identified only as Jane Does. So when police arrived at the Days Inn, room 251 was sealed off like a crime scene. Detectives from Tampa and St. Petersburg converged. Cameras clicked, evidence bags rustled. Every surface was photographed, swabbed, and dusted. And in that clutter of everyday things, hairbrushes, flip-flops, a black t-shirt, there was one unassuming clue: a tube of kids' toothpaste. Prints were lifted from it, and from the bathroom counter. The lab matched them within hours. It was the women from the water. Back at the front desk, the registration card confirmed the rest. A purse held IDs. A wallet had Joe's name in it. Room 251 had the answers. And with that confirmation, reality sank in. It was time to call Ohio. The phone rang again. Jeff Feasby couldn't help himself. He just wanted to hear Michelle's voice, to know she was finally home. Hal answered, but something was wrong. His voice was sharp, like it had been ripped in half. "Who is this?" he snapped. Jeff told him who it was and asked if he had heard anything. Then there was silence. Then Hal exhaled, and in that breath, everything changed. "They're not coming home," he said. At first, Jeff didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "They're gone," Hal said, his voice crumbling. "All of them." That afternoon, everything had unraveled. The sheriff, Hal's old classmate, had driven out to the farm with the kind of look no one ever wants to see. Not long after, a news reporter wandered onto the property with a microphone. Then came the headlines, the calls. The grief spread like wildfire. Jeff didn't know what to do with the rage. He punched a hole through a door, slammed his truck into gear, and drove like he could outrun the news. An hour later, he showed up at the farm. Hal was outside, throwing hay bales into the barn, shoulders tight with fury. He was crying, but he didn't stop working. "The cows don't care," he'd said once. And that was the cruelest thing. The farm didn't pause for grief. The earth didn't stop spinning. So Hal kept going, feeding, milking, moving, while his whole world collapsed around him. The same day, the police also found their Oldsmobile Calais. It was parked just a few miles away at a boat ramp along the Courtney Campbell Parkway. It had been undisturbed since Joe and the girls left it a week before. The doors were locked, and the passenger seat was pushed forward, as though someone had just climbed out of the back. Inside the car was a deck of Uno cards, a puzzle book someone had been working on in the back seat, and a Clearwater Beach brochure. In the front seat was a sheet of Days Inn stationery. Written in Joe's handwriting were directions that had guided them from the motel to the boat ramp. The directions said, "Turn right west on 60, 2.5 miles, on right side alt before. Bridge." Beside these words was one more instruction. Blue with white. Police had no idea who they could have been meeting, but whoever they were, the police believed they owned a blue and white boat. The other big lead Florida investigators got came from one of the detectives at the Van Wert County Sheriff's Office. A detective there wanted to make sure that the investigators were aware of all the facts about the Rogers family, specifically about what had happened with Michelle and her Uncle John. Even though at that point John was serving time in prison, it was hard to ignore the similarities between what happened to Michelle on the farm and there in Tampa Bay. Both times, she had been subjected to bondage and then raped. Although it seemed like a very unlikely scenario, especially in 1989, investigators did consider the possibility that John Rogers might have orchestrated the murders and hired someone to take them out on a boat and kill them. The day after the bodies were identified, 2 detectives were on a plane headed to Ohio to learn more about Joe, Michelle, and Christe Rogers. There are some tragedies too large to fully grasp, too deep, too cruel, too final. The loss of Joe, Michelle, and Christe Rogers was one of them. Not just for Hal, but for the whole community. In those first few days, as the bodies were flown home from Florida, the family found themselves drifting through tasks that felt both impossible and necessary. Funeral arrangements, flowers, what clothes the women should be buried in, and then the brutal reminder: the caskets would be closed. The water had made that decision for them. Somewhere in the blur of grief, Colleen Etzler, Joe's sister-in-law, sat beside Joe's father, Bill, as he stared into the middle distance, his mind clearly somewhere else. "Do you realize how many pallbearers we need?" he said softly. Colleen didn't know what to say. No one did. And Hal was barely holding himself together. He kept milking the cows, feeding them, calling in extra help to keep the farm from falling apart, while his own heart was splintering. But he wasn't present. Not really. He answered every phone call like it might be Joe. Looked out the barn window, expecting to see the Calais in the driveway, the car doors swinging open and the girls bouncing out. Laughter, life, but it never came. Only silence. The guilt settled in, heavy as a stone. One day, Hal turned to Colleen, his voice quiet and broken. "I should have gone with them," he said. "This wouldn't have happened." Colleen swallowed the lump in her throat. What could she say to a man carrying a loss so enormous it bent the world? "Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference if you had," she said, her voice trembling. But the truth was, no one knew. And that was the hardest part. The endless gnawing ache of what if. The pallbearers filled 4 rows of pews. 4 rows. That's how many it took to carry what was left of a family. It was June. A gray, overcast sky hung over Zion Lutheran. Inside, the church was packed. There weren't enough seats. Mourners crowded the basement, the hallways, shoulder to shoulder, and shared sorrow. Outside, the media vans lined the road like a grim procession. Reporters clutched microphones, but weren't allowed inside. Cameras zoomed in from across the street, feeding the story to a world that could barely understand it. Hal Rogers pulled up and counted them. 12 news crews. He wore his only suit, a gray pinstripe Joe had given him, and a raspberry-colored shirt she'd always said brought out the warmth in his skin. It was the kind of shirt a man wears when he wants to make someone he loves smile. Hal wasn't interested in smiling that day, but he wore it anyway. For her. Inside, the 3 caskets waited. One for Joe, one for Michelle, one for Christe. Each was draped in flowers and topped with a framed photo. Hal had asked for a teddy bear to be placed in each of the girls' caskets. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. It was what a father could do. Before the service began, Hal spotted his mother, Irene, the woman who had refused to believe her own granddaughter's cries for help. The tension between them hadn't erased, not even here. He felt his jaw clench, his hands curled into fist. He wanted to swing, but he didn't. He sat down in the front pew instead, silent, trembling. The pastor stood before the crowd and asked the one question everyone had brought with them, but no one dared to speak out loud. Where was God? Where was God on that boat when Joe and the girls were pleading for their lives? Why, oh dear God, why? Reverend Lunderman cried from the pulpit. What in the world was going through God's mind when he decided to allow this to go on. And then he answered, not with logic, but with hope, that God was there, that maybe he wept too, that Joe and the girls were not gone, just moved into eternity, into joy, that heaven had opened to receive them. The room dissolved into tears. Friends clutched strangers, shoulders shook, hands reached across aisles. Grief poured out like water breaking through a dam. All except Hal. Hal didn't cry, at least not where anybody could see it. His face stayed blank, his body still. Grief had frozen him in place. And behind his tinted glasses, no one could read the devastation in his eyes. The caskets were carried out across the road to the cemetery. Michelle's and Christy's friends began to cry out, their sobs too big to contain. And that's when Hal moved. He stepped forward, gently pulled flowers from the arrangements, and handed them one by one to the girls' friends. Then he turned away, walked across the road, back into the church. I just want to be by myself, he said. A neighbor's son guarded the doors so no one would follow. Hal sat alone in a pew. The church was quiet. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed. And when he was ready, Hal went back home, took off his suit, put on his overalls, and went to the barn because the cows still needed to be fed. The feed still needed grinding. The police investigation was already heading in a dozen different directions and running into just as many complications. Nothing about the case was going to be easy. First, it wasn't even clear which city's department should take the lead. The bodies had been recovered from waters near St. Petersburg, but Joe and her daughters had gone missing from a hotel in Tampa. Eventually, a special task force was formed with over 24 investigators drawn from both cities' department, the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the Florida Marine Patrol. And since the bodies had been found in the water, the task force had to work without the kind of evidence typically found at a scene on land. We absolutely have nothing to go on, a Tampa homicide detective told reporters. We're just hoping someone saw something. No unfamiliar fingerprints had been identified in room 251 of the Days Inn. Most of those found belonged to the Rogers women or hotel staff. Likewise, nothing unusual had been found on the exterior or interior of the Rogers car. In fact, the Oldsmobile Calais was notably clean, as if someone had thoroughly wiped it down. The only real clue was a clear water beach brochure found in the car. On the back was a map of Tampa Bay marked with directions, not in Joe Rogers' handwriting, that led to the Days Inn. Clearly, Joe and the girls had encountered someone who helped them navigate their way to the motel. But who that person was or how they met remained a mystery. Even the cause of death couldn't be pinpointed. The medical examiner confirmed they had died by asphyxiation, but it couldn't be determined whether they had drowned or if it had been caused by the ropes found around their necks. The conditions of the bodies made many questions impossible to answer. Still, investigators believed the most likely scenario was that the women were restrained, probably forcing each of them to witness what happened to the others, and then dropped into the bay. As for how many people might have been involved, there were differing theories. Some believed it would have taken more than one person to control 3 victims. Others noted that a single armed individual could have forced one person to tie up the others. Either way, the level of planning and control required suggested someone experienced and cruel. It also appeared that the person responsible may have taken satisfaction in controlling the situation and its victims. Using credit card records and receipts, investigators tracked the Rogers family movements through Florida. They developed the rolls of film left in the motel room and analyzed the photos for possible leads. One noticeable absence: the Nikon one-touch camera used to take these photos was missing. This suggested the person responsible may have taken it, possibly as a grand memento. From there, detectives fanned out across Florida and into Georgia. They compiled lists of every guest and employee at the motels where the family stayed. They began reaching out one by one. They interviewed the Days Inn employee who helped Joe check in. They talked to a businessman who remembered seeing Joe and her daughters at dinner the night they vanished. They spoke to people at the boat ramp where the family car had been abandoned. They searched nearby construction sites for concrete blocks that matched those used to weigh the bodies down. They reached out to the FBI's behavioral science unit to help sketch a profile of the kind of individual capable of this act. They consulted with title experts from the University of South Florida, who confirmed that based on current patterns and where the bodies were recovered, it was unlikely the women had entered the water from land or a bridge. Instead, it was growing more likely that they had been taken onto a boat and killed there. That brought investigators back to the handwritten directions in the car, the one that mentioned meeting someone with a blue and white boat. Detectives scoured the boat ramp and surrounding areas, asking if anyone had seen a vessel matching that description. They compared the names of motel guests with more than 700,000 registered boat owners in Florida and thousands more in Ohio. Each day, they released new bulletins and flyers with the boat's description. A $5,000 reward was offered for any information leading to an arrest and conviction. More than 800 tips poured in over the following weeks, but sorting and verifying each one was overwhelming. Investigators logged, ranked, and checked them out, but one by one, each was eliminated. Early on, one tip seemed promising. A man in Hillsborough County owned a blue and white boat and had reportedly offered a ride to a couple at the same ramp where Joe and her daughters had gone. When detectives arrived at his home, they saw the boat parked in the driveway and 2 concrete blocks behind it, one stained. Inside the boat was yellow and white rope resembling the kind used to restrain the victims. They questioned the man and his wife. At first, he said he'd been out on the water with friends that day, but then he pulled a detective aside. There was more to the story, he admitted quietly. He said he had actually been out with someone else, a woman his wife didn't know about. Detectives followed up, and his story held. His alibi was verified. He agreed to a polygraph test and passed. Another lead, another dead end. Of all the avenues the investigation took in those early days, none drew more curiosity or suspicion than the road back to Ohio. Detectives Ralph Flagger and Henry Duran from St. Petersburg and Tampa made the long trip north to Van Wert County, not once, but twice, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might explain why Joe Rogers and her 2 daughters ended up dead in Florida waters. At the top of their list, John Rogers, Joe's brother-in-law, who'd been accused of sexually assaulting Michelle. There was, on the surface, a possible motive, a reason for someone to hold a terrible grudge. But did John have the means? The reach? Hal Rogers, trying to make sense of what happened to his wife and daughters, didn't shy away from the topic. I wouldn't be surprised if John could have had something to do with it, he told detectives. But to put it bluntly, I think it would be a very remote possibility. At the time of the murders, John Rogers was already behind bars. But it was his presence in Florida months earlier that raised eyebrows. His parents often spent winters in Elleton, just south of the Sunshine Skyway. John had visited them there in early 1989, just months before Joe and the girls made their trip. Could he have set something in motion during that visit? But that was what Flagger and Duran needed to find out. They interviewed John directly at the prison, as well as his cellmates. What they found was a man who was a loner, with no friends and no pull. His records show no recent phone calls or unusual mail. His only visitor in months had been his mother. There was no sign he even knew about the Florida trip. After speaking with him and checking what little there was to verify, the detectives agreed. It was unlikely he had played a role in the crime. But while they were in Ohio, another person came under closer scrutiny, someone far more present in the victims' lives, Hal Rogers. The detectives uncovered something that had long made people in Van Wert uncomfortable. Hal had paid his brother's bail. Despite knowing the accusations against John, including those involving his own daughter, Hal personally arranged the $10,000 surety bond. That wasn't all. In early June, before the bodies had been identified, but after the women had disappeared, Hal withdrew $7,000 in cash from the local bank. It wasn't clear why or where the money went. Still, as detectives pieced together Hal's timeline, the logistics didn't fit. On the day of the murders, Hal had been on the farm, milking cows as usual. The nearest airport was over an hour away in Indiana, and there simply wasn't time for him to travel to Florida, commit the crime, and return without raising suspicion. Plus, there was no clear motive. But the money, it lingered as a question. Could Hal, grieving and unsure, have asked someone else to carry out an unthinkable act? That idea required a motive, and one just didn't surface. The detective spent hours with Hal at the farm. He seemed hollowed out, emotionally wrecked, and running on fumes. Flagger would later describe the look in Hal's eyes as a 100-mile stare. Still, they needed answers. Why had he posted his brother's bond? Others had asked too, but Hal's answer never changed. He said that when he first agreed to help, the only accusation he knew about was one involving a woman who had shared John's trailer. By the time Michelle's name came up, Hal had already given his word. And in his world, once you gave your word, you didn't go back on it. Privately, Hal told the detectives he believed Michelle. But he also said he was caught in the middle between his daughter and his family and trying to find a way to keep the peace. He said he had asked John to sell his half of the farm and stay away for good. That was part of the deal. Then there was the matter of the money. A $7,000 withdrawal made shortly after Joe and the girls vanished, but before they'd been identified. The timing was suspicious, and the amount was significant. Had Hal used the money to pay someone? Well, as for the cash, Hal said he withdrew it during the worst days of uncertainty, when Joe and the girls were still missing. He had planned to drive to Florida himself, searching, asking questions. But before he could, he got the news that they were gone. He explained that he didn't own credit cards, didn't trust them, so he needed the cash for travel. When Duran, almost as an afterthought, asked what became of the money, Hal didn't hesitate. He led them to his pickup truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out a bank bag with $6,000 inside. The remaining $1,000, it was in his pocket. The road to Ohio had raised difficult questions, but it didn't provide any solid answers. When the detectives returned from Ohio, it was clear whatever darkness had claimed Joe, Michelle, and Christe, it hadn't followed them from Ohio. It started and ended in Florida, which meant it was random. The Rogers women had likely crossed paths with a stranger during their trip, maybe at a gas station, maybe at a roadside attraction, maybe at the boat ramp where their car was found. At some point, they met someone, talked with him, trusted him enough to follow him onto a boat. And that trust got them killed. The randomness of it all made the case even harder to crack. With no connection to the killer, no relationship to trace, investigators were left with a haunting puzzle and no edges to start from. The early weeks had been frantic, tip lines ringing, leads pouring in, a task force made up of multiple agencies chasing every possible angle. But the momentum didn't last. The calls slowed, the leads dried up, the task force disbanded. What began with over 20 investigators was now down to 4, then 2. Even the officials leading the charge began to sound defeated. "We really have no place to go," admitted Major Cliff Fouts. "That's what we're doing now, just hoping someone comes forward." But the longer it dragged on, the less likely it seemed. The trail had gone cold, and the waters of Tampa Bay, which had given up the Rogers women, were silent once again.